Carbon Transition podcast. My name is Jacqueline Pinto, and I'm joined by my podcast co hosts Joaquim Fonskiel and Eric Raku. And today we're very excited to have Ciara Remeshid, a director of Shortlist Futures, a workforce innovation lab driving employment, growth, and impact in Africa, with us here today to kick off season 2. Welcome, Ciara.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So, perhaps to start us off, would you mind telling us a little bit about your why, your decarbonization journey, and a little bit about Shortlist Futures?
Sure. Great. Yes. And so happy to be here and get to talk about our work and a little bit more about myself. So, I sort of studied and grew up really caring about the impacts that US foreign policy was having on emerging markets. I think we're all aware of what's happening now, so it feels more prescient than ever. But studied human rights law, studied globalization, and was really curious to understand what policy decisions here were having as an impact on the ground. I kind of came to climate a little bit later in my journey. But I think what's so interesting about climate in the context of Africa is it really is this opportunity to leapfrog development and create not just more access to productive uses of energy, but to offer economic opportunity, livelihood opportunity, and really help to accelerate growth paths that we haven't otherwise seen. And yeah, maybe just a little bit on Shortlist Futures. So as you
Yeah.
mentioned, we're a workforce innovation lab. And so we're really focused on trying to find tip of the spear ideas, innovations, research to help not just think about placing people into jobs or finding them opportunities, but push the envelope to create new jobs, to help sectors grow, to support the growth of companies, and just see sort of wider spread economic opportunity.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think when you speak about these new jobs, I mean, just in preparation, I was reading your report that recently came out, BCG, FSD Africa, and Shortlist. And it said that you forecast that in Africa, or specific countries in Africa, that there could be up to as many as 3.3 million jobs created by 2030, which sometimes I think we say the word 2030, but that's 5 years away. And but in what sectors are we seeing this? Green is a very big term. Where are we seeing these jobs being created?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, the report, super high level, right? We're looking at 3.3 million new jobs. I think two important caveats to think about here is we really were just looking at direct jobs in 12 value chains, which is to say, if we were looking at electric mobility, we weren't looking at the number of, say, new Boda drivers in Nairobi who are delivering, your food on Glovo, but actually looking at jobs as charging station attendants, engineers, manufacturing, et cetera. So it excludes those indirect jobs. So these are really, truly just direct. But what we found is there's 3.3 million new jobs, largely driven by the three largest economies, Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. And the three sectors that really came out as the biggest winners, or drivers rather, are solar with nearly 70% of new job creation, climate smart or energy enabled agriculture. And then, sort of, the sleeping giant in my mind is what do we do with all of this waste remediation and recycling? And so, really thinking about what opportunities there are in circularity in these different markets.
Wow. And so you said you focused on those three key economies. Was there a specific reason, or just because they are key economies in Africa, and so they sort of are they representative of the rest of Africa? Is there, anything like that, some kind of
Yeah.
connection?
Sure. So we actually focused on 5 countries in total. Those three were just the ones that drove the most jobs, which I wasn't entirely surprised, given
Okay.
sort of their market size, market share, and I think also importantly, market maturity, particularly when it comes to solar. The other 2 countries we did focus in on were the DRC, primarily because it is the least electrified country on the continent, and so wanted to understand the
Yeah.
potential and opportunities there, as well as Ethiopia, which has had its own sort of dynamics and challenges in recent years, but massive opportunities when it comes to like biodigesters, um,
Okay.
agriculture, manufacturing, potentially green hydrogen, et cetera. The others we sort of took a Pan African view on, so they're not detailed specifically, but you could go into our data, which is publicly accessible, and look at different country by country breakdowns outside of those 5.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sierra, a question there. Um, how much of those, say, 3.3 million new jobs estimated would you say would relate to to manufacturing in Africa. So producing, let's say, solar panels or whatever in Africa, because there is always going on now in lately this discussion about self-sufficiency and so on. So being dependent on other countries. How can that develop in Africa, and how much of that do you forecast is among those 3.3 million jobs?
Sure. I'd have to look up the exact figure. I don't want to
Yeah,
misquote you, but
so,
the way that we thought about this is we looked at both the immediate opportunities, so between now and 2030, and then a longer term view to 2050.
mhm,
I believe manufacturing as its own subsector was sort of grouped in this larger 2050 vision, mainly
okay.
because currently there's like an underutilization of Africa's potential for manufacturing.
Mhm,
Where we would have seen that, though, specifically maybe in terms of jobs, would again sort of be in for electric mobility, right? Like Ampersand based out of Rwanda and Kenya, Bossy Go, any of these types of players you might have heard of. There's a bunch in
mhm,
South Africa. Is their move towards localizing more of the production of their vehicles. Right now, most of them are importing from Europe, from Asia, but the sort of like built for Africa
mhm.
piece is really important to them. And we are seeing more of that. So you're seeing pockets of it in the immediate term, but it would mostly be, I think, further out just because the
Yeah,
heavy investments in that haven't happened yet.
makes sense. Okay, thank you. Mhm,
And Sierra, so we're talking about, I mean, I'm very interested. Actually, I'm a South African myself, so I love it when we have a focus on Africa, but we're talking about green jobs, we're talking about future proofing, and I feel like we can't have that conversation without speaking a little bit about tech and AI. And
Mhm.
actually, this was something that we got from our audience members before, and we had a specific audience question saying, but young people don't actually want to do manual labor. People prefer to do digital, remote work. Flexibility is very important. How are you seeing that? Is that perhaps more of a Eurocentric view, or is that something you're seeing in Africa as well? And if so, how does that affect the green jobs? And I'm especially interested in this because I read this report by the World Economic Forum, Future of Jobs report. And to my shock, and maybe it's not a big shock to everyone else, but the biggest growing job or that they forecast is manual labor and farm work. And that was, I didn't expect that at all. So, how are we seeing this interplay between technology, manual labor, a young workforce, a young
Mhm.
African workforce? How are all of those interrelating and playing out? And do you, as Shortlist Futures, thought about this?
Yeah, no, definitely a thing we're thinking about all the time. In another part of our work, we work on the green economy and in the digital economy. We actually just started a grant with the Gates Foundation trying to find use cases of high potential opportunities where low income women from across Africa can benefit from these advancements in AI that companies might be using. So community health worker platforms, it could be a solar installation platform as well. And so I guess what I would have to say to that is agriculture presently makes up the majority of jobs in Africa, but right now it's mostly subsistence farming. I think where the WEF numbers could be interesting, or where we might look to kind of push beyond this sort of subsistence place we have been, is bringing in more mechanization into these value chains. So, for example, there's lots of companies that are doing solar water pumps. There's biodigesters. There's more energy or renewable energy enabled agriculture products and services, smart metering, right? All these types of things can be brought into the agricultural space to both make that work slightly less backbreaking,
Yeah.
but to also, add value to what it is these people are producing. We work with a company called Keep It Cool. They do post-harvest refrigeration, and the income gains, right, that a woman might see who's farming tilapia out of Lake Naivasha in Kenya, who's now able to actually save her harvest and sell more of it to the market and sell more of it, you're seeing really profound gains in income. And so it'll take time, but there is opportunity where I think even if we see future growth mainly in ag, there's ways that we can help to push to advance it, to add value to product, to stimulate more demand where people are able to be more productive as a result of that.
Okay, so you see them actually working hand in hand. It's something that can assist the green jobs transition and all of that. Okay.
Certainly.
And you mentioned women, and I just feel like the minute you mentioned women, something went off in my head because obviously I'm also a South African woman. And so Do we see any specific barriers to entry into the green workforce for women? Anything that is prohibitive? You
Mhm.
know, and I'm speaking generally across the board. And if there is any specific sort of story or something that you have experience with, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, maybe actually I'll walk you through two quick examples or stories.
Yeah.
So, um, I mean, the barriers that exist for women to enter the workforce for energy are no different than I think the barriers that exist broadly. We've done a ton of research on this, two
Okay.
reports that I can share. But to dive into these two examples, so the first is that there's been tons more rooftop installation of solar on buildings, on hospitals, on residential houses, wine farms in the Western Cape, for
Yeah.
example. And so, what this has meant is that women are getting trained in this skill. It's a great skill to have because it doesn't necessarily require an advanced degree. It's usually a certification course. So it's a lot easier for them to access. What we found, though, in working with several companies, and one company in particular in Nigeria, is they were like, man, we've trained all these women. They now have this skill. The reason that we can't get them to work is we simply don't have the PPE equipment or the work belts that they need for them to actually now be able to safely go on these rooftops, go on these buildings to use this skill, right? To now do
Wow.
this job. And so the
Mm.
barriers are often little, like it's a quite
Small.
small thing, right? But if you're a small and growing business, if you're operating in a capital constrained environment, right,
Yeah.
expending that extra amount for them is quite difficult, and women themselves as well have a hard time fronting that. So thinking through things like that is important. I think the other, I think, major opportunity we saw, hopefully you'll appreciate this, is we've worked with several electric mobility companies based in the Western Cape. And so one of them focuses on helping women from township environments actually
Okay.
um, do last mile delivery of goods and services for off takers. So, a Woolworths, a Pick and Pay, a Take a Lot, they're the ones who are now delivering these items to customers as they might be placing these orders. Due to some, safety concerns, women are often not delivering at night, which is one of the peak earning opportunities for them. So we worked with them to develop a specific training program around sales and selling of other goods in daytime hours so that women's wages could be stabilized essentially in comparison to their male peers, right? You could imagine a chart. It's like peak in morning, trough, peak in the afternoon for lunch, trough, and then dinner. And so, whereas a men's curve might look like that in the day, we were trying to get a woman's to look flatter by having them sell in those trough periods. And we've been able to do that with this company, Green Riders, which has been really exciting because I think otherwise township economies don't really offer many economic opportunities for women. So this has been a
Yeah.
really great way for them to be able to engage more successfully.
Wow. Honestly, I'm so inspired and I love that story. Thank you so much for those anecdotes. I think it's really important also for us to remember that it's often on a micro level, on an every person level, it is the small everyday problems that stop this energy transition. You know, we're always looking at it, or at least me, from a very high level perspective. Like, how do we drive the energy transition? But how do we drive it in everyone's day to day life? You know, and it's these types of issues, safety. How do we, and maybe linking on to that, you're speaking about townships and the places where
Mhm.
these people are from. And I'm wondering, do you have any sort of stories or any insights about how green jobs can drive sustainable development in communities themselves? Because people aren't separated from where they're from, and so their job is an integral part of that. So anything to do with that?
Yeah. So I actually got my career started in climate, working at the Rockefeller Foundation on their power and climate team. And at the time, we were looking at how do you spur economic development at a community level through the use of mini grids in areas of India that were or under electrified. So as you can imagine, basically the context was the Indian government had given access to energy to everybody, but it was really unreliable. So while the tariff for that energy was quite low, people were still reliant on diesel gensets and backup generators, which are quite expensive. And so we thought, can we come in here with a market intervention around mini grid power? It's priced in between these two, but we know that people are willing to pay right for this diesel power. So if we bring in mini grid power at less, we should be able to convert people to this. Conversion
Yeah.
was possible, right? And then the question becomes, okay, great. Now that there's power available in this community, how do we encourage the whole community to benefit from it and use it more productively? So we thought a lot about this concept of demand stimulation, right? It's, you might have you'll have businesses in these communities. You have sort of streets and villages that have lots of shops. So now it's, how do you connect these shops to electricity? How do you get them more advanced, for example, sewing machines, so that women who are running sewing shops can now produce more? How do you or help people access other devices, milling machines, oil expellers, right, to add value to the crops or the other things that they might be selling. And so it's kind of that community-led and informed approach around demand stimulation that allowed us to not just bring power into these communities, but ensure that people sort of writ large, right, were able to benefit from it economically.
Yeah. Yeah. And Sierra, perhaps a bit more of a difficult question, but we're talking about these um, 2030 timelines, 2050 timelines, and we're talking about a lot of upskilling. I mean, I read in that same WEF report that 59% of people, everyone, 59% of everyone globally will need to be upskilled by 2030, 5 years' time. And that 92 million jobs will be displaced, but that 172 million jobs will be created. But those 172 million jobs, we need the skills for it now. And I know that this is something Shortlist Futures is doing, but I'd love to get a bit more insight. How do we prepare our workforce in the time that we have
Mm-hmm.
for the jobs of the futures? For me, what kind of skills should I be getting? What kind of skills should the guy listening to this in Africa be getting? Should everyone be getting
Mm-hmm.
to try and sort of future proof our jobs?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's probably the hardest question.
Yeah, I
um,
know.
no, what I was going to say is I almost think about this from two levels. So I think the first is like, I can't not think of it from a systems perspective. And so I think the
Yeah,
first port of call is like, if you're a government, if you're a policymaker, it's look at those figures, understand where your labor market is today, and do the labor market analysis to understand, great, we have a deficit of X number of, say, solar engineers that we're going to need to train up on this. So how do we now today start to talent pipeline to ensure that there will be sufficient number of people to have those jobs in the future, so that we're able to move at a pace that we would like to be seeing, right? That's kind of my like meta systems
yeah,
perspective. I think we also, what's hard about those figures, right, is they're almost so large that they're not specific. And I think, we've worked with, I want to say 1,100 companies now across the African continent. And when we talk to them about young people, what they're looking for in skills, the number one thing I think that almost every company we've ever worked with would say is that they're just looking for people who are lifetime learners, who are agile, who are adaptable, who are willing
yeah,
to take on and new challenges and try new things. And I think so much will still change, the way that AI has fundamentally already started to change the workforce in just about a year and a half, right? If you maintain that sort of ability or flexibility around skill development, learning, you can sort of adapt with the times. Because I imagine 2050, like who knows
yeah.
where the digital transformation will have taken us. But again, if you sort of have that orientation towards being willing to do those things, um, you'll be able to
Able
benefit, I
to.
think, from the transitions that we might be experiencing in the future.
Okay, so we're talking about sort of societal cultural shifts, but also our own personal cultural shift within our mind to sort of educate ourselves, look at things differently, and upskill ourselves, knowing. And obviously, we can look at your report and get a little bit of insight.
But
Joaquin, it looks like you want to say something.
no, I'm reflecting on that and see if we can build a little bit on the discussions we had already so far. There might be a need all the time of, what should we call them, ambassadors or something like that. So the ambassadors of change, right? And to help these people with their skills and help them to make the message out there. And sometimes it's in a big city, sometimes in a township or whatever is the situation. And I think that is extremely important, because this is about change, but it's also of course important that at the same time that there is a response to that change, that people see something positive coming, because it doesn't help that people run around and talk, well, I got all these new skills about solar power and most people don't have electricity, you know.
Hmm.
th- there is a complexity around it, that I think sometimes might be your your everyday work there, Sarah. How can you help this moving forward? Of course, we cannot change everything overnight, but do you have any tips, maybe to people, and so on? Because I think we all want this change to happen, but don't want it to backfire. So
Hmm.
you need to build on the good examples with people, and people would feel and see that there are some real positive changes, and then we can get momentum from it, and even more people will come to you and other organizations and learn more. Please, can you elaborate a little? I got a bit lengthy here, but you got my
No, no,
point, I
no,
guess.
no, no worries.
Mm,
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of answered the question a little bit yourself. I mean, to me, I think it's the power of demonstration models, right? And thinking
mm,
about what are the unique factors in this market, this sub-region, country writ large that are present, and how can we uniquely now create an example of something that'll demonstrate to people the potential in this. Because I think more often what I can think of, right, are examples where that hasn't happened, and then people are wary about the change, they're unsure about the job loss, and they're they both want this, but they're hesitant, right? Because you're talking about people's livelihoods at the end of the day. Like I think about the shutting down of like the Kamadi power plant in South Africa, which has left it's sort of like the main driver, right, of economic activity in this area. It got shut down without a just energy transition plan, and it's sort of left that community behind, right?
Yeah.
mm,
And we have an issue because we have too many examples of things like that. But I think if what we could think through is, looking at what's happening in Nigeria versus what might be happening in, Zambia, right, or wherever it might be, and showing the potential, positive examples of potential. They don't need to be massive in scale, I don't think, but being able to prove and drive that to get people bought into it and believe that the change is possible is really, really important. I mean, we see it all the time as well, just even with the young people that we're working with in terms of jobs. So many of them are like, I didn't study engineering, so there's no way I can work
mm,
in solar. Because in their mind, a solar job is only a solar engineer. And you have to
mm,
sort of step back and say, actually, you could have a plethora of skills, right? You could be an HR admin person at a renewable energy company and be just as valuable to this green transition as you are as a solar engineer, right? It takes almost a lensed approach to address these challenges. And so it's just a lot, I think, around mindset and proving to people where the potential is.
mm. Having the attitude, you can always add the skills if you have the attitude, of course.
Exactly.
Mm, good.
But I think it's also you're speaking about advocacy and, having the right mindset. But I'm wondering, so who are these people? How important are partnerships between
Mm.
different stakeholders when we're speaking about promoting green jobs?
Yeah.
Government, private sector, NGOs. Who who are these actors? And, have you seen successful collaborations in this space in Africa? Or are you seeing it mostly private sector? Who's
Yeah.
who's pushing this?
No, for sure. I mean, I think the private sector plays a huge role in this, particularly because energy as a proposition is a capital intensive proposition, right? You can't do it in a purely NGO approach. You probably need, you need blended finance. You need people coming in from different perspectives to support these various investments. And when I think of maybe places where this feels really successful to me, is there's an organization in Nigeria called All On, which is really about bringing together, right, all these stakeholders you've talked through, your community organizations, your industry associations, the private sector, universities, DFIs, international donors, private investors, to centralize their focus, right, on how do we advance all these different priorities we have within energy access and the energy transition in the Nigerian context to be able to advance this. And so, while there are pockets, right, of this almost ecosystem coordination happening, there's more of that that's needed. I think the question then becomes, do you think about it country by country because they all have
Yeah.
different market dynamics? Do you think about it at a regional level? I mean, in Kenya, for example, we're selling excess power to neighbors, so there is need for intra-African collaboration as well. And then again, as I think we were speaking about earlier, right, this potential with like green hydrogen, right? You might have the production of it in North Africa, selling it into Europe. And so I think it's just really understanding where are those partnership or potential for partnership and collaboration, and who are those stakeholders who need to be involved, and then actually coordinating them to ensure that everybody is on the same page around priorities, what needs to get done, and how to sort of work through different challenges.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think part of the challenge will figure out how do we do that? How do we create those platforms? How do we also create knowledge sharing platforms? Because we need to be able to share the wins and the success stories so that people also know this model works, which is actually something I really liked about reading your report, because you made all of the data sets and the information publicly available, even the spreadsheets, which I mean, I must admit lost me, because Excel is not my favorite thing. But I think that's what we need to be doing when it comes to green jobs. You know, we need to be sharing the information, having knowledge sharing platforms, especially in Africa, you know,
Mm-hmm.
because the situation in Africa, and obviously Africa isn't some homogenous, you know, continent, but it is different to the rest of the world or to Europe. Or do you disagree? Do you think that green jobs in are, you know, how do they compare to other regions globally when you compare it to Africa?
Yeah. I mean, I think the jobs are the same. I would maybe provocatively
Yeah,
suggest, though, that I think the imperative is more important in Africa. Like, we are, being very blunt, I think we're in like a jobs crisis.
yeah,
30% of Africa's population does not have employment levels. For youth, it's 60. Some people even think that that 60% is underreported, and you have 11 million new job entrants entering the market for 3 million new jobs being created a year, right? So there's a real need, I think, to figure this out and figure it out quickly. And so, even just the example of our data set, we can't afford to be precious about this information we have. It needs to be shared because we need everybody focused in on this and using the best and most reliable information and data that we all have access to be able to move on this, I think, as quickly as possible.
no, perfect. I see we have 3 minutes left. So before I ask for some closing thoughts, Joaquin, anything, you know, wanting to ask Sierra before we lose her?
First of all, let me praise. This is so important and so great to see this fantastic job that you are doing, and I think that many times it's a two-step transition that we have to transition into, maybe producing more and getting more people into jobs, and then in the second step sometimes taking them into green jobs. It's not always that we can jump into the green job immediately. Whenever we can, that's fantastic, but sometimes maybe that's not the situation. Or so the question is simply, what do you think about that, Sierra?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm in the perspective of a young person in Africa looking for a job, I think
Mm.
amazing. If you can be mission aligned, impact aligned, and find a job in a green job, that's amazing. I think, though, however, most people don't really have access to jobs or economic opportunity, and I would never begrudge anybody, of trying to find an employment opportunity
Yeah.
elsewhere, right? I think what's important, though, is if you are a young person, if any of you are listening, if you are a young person who's maybe found yourself at a job working for Chanarana, the a grocery store chain in Nairobi, the skill that you are learning there will and ultimately can always be something transferable to help you get into that green job eventually. So I don't think that they're competitive or mutually exclusive, right? One can totally feed into the other, just as you're suggesting.
Yeah,
Good point.
I love that. And now with 1 minute left, but you know, there is obviously some flexibility. Obviously, Sarah, you've given us so much to think about, and it has been a really eye-opening conversation, even for me. I've really enjoyed it. But if you could ask the audience to take away one thought, you know, we like to do the segment at the end where we think about what we do we talk around the coffee machine. If someone from the audience could speak about one thing around the coffee machine that they heard on this podcast the other day whilst they were driving to work, what would you want them to take away?
It's a great question. I mean, I've always been a very political person, and so I think for me, my challenge would be what can you do within your locus of control to advance something around what we talked about here. If you're in the
Yeah.
U.S., right, are you writing your congressperson? If you're somewhere else, are you campaigning for clean water access? Right, like think about Greta Thunberg as an example. I think we all actually do have power in this
Yeah.
and we do have a voice, and I think that agency and ability to push on these things is something we can actually all do. So I think I'd find something in here and hopefully go push that where you think you might have influence.
Sierra, thank you so much. I don't think I can
Okay.
add anything more other than to say a huge, huge thank you to you and Shortlist Futures. And I hope that someone in the audience today goes out and finds their voice. Have a wonderful afternoon, rest of the day, everyone, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sarah.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, we are off live now.
Hmm.